صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. I begin in the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. All praise belongs to Him, the one who creates but is not created, the one who sees but is unseen, the one who provides guidance but is not in need of guidance, and the one who gave us the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam as the best example for us to follow in this life. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. والكاظمين الغيظ والعافين عن الناس والله يحب المحسنين صدق الله العلي العظيم. This ayat of the Quran that I just recited before you is from Surah Al-Imran, the 3rd chapter of the Quran. And the brief translation of this verse, the partial, is I recited the verse partially, and I chose it partially because there's a certain aspect of it that I want to emphasize. Those who control their anger and are forgiving towards mankind, Allah loves those who do good. Throughout the Quran, you'll find different attributes about those who are pious, those who do good. And so in this particular verse, the one aspect I want to focus on is the person who we are honoring today, which is Imam Musa Al-Ghadeer alayhi salam. It describes a person who is trying to get righteous as somebody who restrains their anger. So, Al-Qadhimin, this is a plural. The title that Imam Musa Al-Ghadeer that was given, in the Arabic grammar, it is known as Ism Fa'al. He is the one who is controlling, restraining his anger. So then it begs the question, why was he given this title? Why is he called Al-Ghadeer? Now there are different reasons, there are different things, but obviously all the members of Ahlul Bayt were given had this particular quality and characteristic. It's not that, for example, only Imam Musa Al-Ghadeer had this and none of the other members of Ahlul Bayt had this, for Allah. It's just that sometimes each of the members of the family of the Prophet, given some certain unique and individual circumstances, were given particular titles. You had Imam Muhammad Al-Baqir, the one who splits knowledge, and then so on and so forth. So Imam Musa Al-Ghadeer, as we said, Al-Ghadeer is a person who restrains his or her anger. So how did he do so? What are some examples? One example was that during his lifetime, there was a man who used to constantly pester him, who used to annoy him. So there was a very brief incident where this man would go up to Imam and just start harassing him, haranguing him, and the followers of the Imam wanted to do something about it. The Imam restrained him. So then later on, the Imam goes to the garden of this man. And at first the man was like, why is Imam Musa coming to my garden? So without going into any great detail, the man and the Imam, they have a dialogue discussion. So there's a concern on the man's part that his garden may not be reaping any fruits or any benefits. So Imam Al-Ghadeer basically, out of his generosity, gave him profits that he calculated that he would have had if his garden was good. So based on this generosity and based on the fact that Imam kept his anger and he restrained his anger, this man became one of the followers of Imam Musa Al-Ghadeer. Another example, and this is one of the themes of Imam Musa Al-Ghadeer's life, was Imam Musa Al-Ghadeer was constantly placed in prison. He spent over 15 years of his life in prison. One of the most beautiful du'as that he's known to have said in light of this particular situation was, "Oh Allah, I ask you to give me spare time for your worship." How many of us would do that in that kind of circumstance? In other words, let's say, suppose for a minute, you're unjustly incarcerated through no fault of your own. They throw you in prison. And then they decide to lock you up for like 15, 20 years. How many of us in our right mind would say, "Oh, thanks God, now I can spend all my time worshiping you"? Most of us would be like, "Oh God, why did this happen to me? What did I do to deserve this?" We would be very angry at the world. We'd be like, "Oh, what kind of injustice has come upon me?" Not Imam Musa Al-Ghadeer. Instead, he thanks and he praises Allah for the opportunity to worship Him in solitude. So what are some of the lessons that we can learn from Imam Musa al-Kazim? I mean, there's a couple of them. And one of the things that we want to focus on is this issue of ghadab, anger. But before I get to this issue of ghadab, anger, something that we need to reflect on. Often in our gatherings, in the times that we are together, we hear speakers, we hear events where the lives of our Ahlul Bayt are mentioned, but they're mentioned in a way where the lessons are not established. In other words, we see them almost the way, for example, the Greeks, ancient Greeks or Hindus, they have this concept of mythology where they have these amazing figures who they can never aspire to, and they just have these phenomenal stories. So we cannot fall into that trap. We definitely have very beautiful stories with the members of Ahlul Bayt, but we need to take lessons from them. So it doesn't really behoove us to just simply say, oh, they were great people, yeah, and inshallah, Allah bless them. We need to take specific lessons from them, otherwise we are doing them injustice. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Imam Ali alayhi salam said, protect yourself from anger, for its beginning is insanity, and its end is remorse. Now let's think about that for a second. Its end is remorse. How many times have we been in a situation where we were angry, we just lost control, and maybe a day later we were like, my God, what did I just do? What did I just say? How many of us have been in that situation? I don't think there isn't a single one of us who has not been in that situation. So we need to reflect on this whole issue of ghadab, anger. It's a very, very powerful emotion, and we need to control it. A human being is at his or her most dangerous during three situations, three emotions, I should say. Number one, when the human being is in fear. Number two, when a human being has a desire for something. And number three, when a human being is in anger. So what do I mean? When a human being is in fear, for example, what happens? You look, for example, in a Western world, you see that Muslims often are the target of Islamophobia, and a lot of this is due to fear of Muslims, not having enough knowledge. So sometimes when fear exists where there's not enough knowledge or there's a misperception of something, so we see that in Western society towards Muslims as a whole. Now let's also go to the Muslim world. The Muslim world is not immune from this as well, as most of us know. Most of us are followers of Ahlul Bayt. We know that the followers of our particular school of thought are not immune from this, where because of a lack of a certain kind of misperceived fear of us, people, there's discriminatory acts. Recently, some of you may know that in applications, Hajj applications in a certain country, you're asked to mention if you're Shia or not. So fear is a very, very powerful emotion. Let's look at early history in this country. The 1950s, even before Islamophobia, before Muslims and Islam became prominent in the eyes of most Western people. You had McCarthyism, you had communism. Communism was the bogeyman before Islamophobia, before all this happened. For those of you who might remember in the 80s, up until late 80s, people still had a very powerful fear of communism. Now, I'm not here to justify communism, but what's interesting to note is that if you asked most of these people who had this fear of communism, very, very few even knew what communism was. And again, I'm not here to promote communism, but it just goes to show how people can have a very irrational fear of something in which they have no knowledge of. This whole era of McCarthyism in the 1950s, people were taken away, people were put in jail, all for this fear of potentially being labeled a communist. Number two, this issue of desire. I mean, we see this in the Quran when it talks about this whole story of Nabi Yusuf. I mean, he was a prophet of God, but even all human beings can be tempted with a desire. He had a married woman, Zulaykha, who was coming on to him, and he did his best to resist. Everyone, different people have been in situations where they have been tempted. So people are capable of committing some very, very bad sins and doing bad things during these times. Fear, we said, was number one, and desire, we said, is number two. On the flip side, if we learn to control ourselves during these times, we can show ourselves and show what kind of strong characters and personalities we have. And finally, number three, anger. Now we know what the consequences of anger are, right? Look at a lot of people in prison and society, people who have murdered, committed violence. More often than not, it was because they were angry and they had a hard time restraining their anger. Instead, they decided to make a poor decision, and the way they handled the anger was through violence. So this is something that we should all be cognizant of. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Now let's analyze this a little bit more further. Why do we get angry? You know, there's a whole host of reasons why we can get angry, but I just would like to briefly share with you some basic ones that many of us face. Number one, expectations are not met. So what do I mean? Let's say, you know, you're working for a company, you work hard, you're hoping for a promotion, but despite your best efforts, you don't get that promotion, you're passed over through no fault of your own. So that's a common thing. Well, for example, let's talk about a sense of loss. Sometimes people, if they experience a tragedy, say a loss of a loved one or a loss of money, their first reaction, especially when they themselves had nothing to do with it, their first reaction is, oh God, why me? It is a very common human reaction. And so this builds up anger, and unfortunately, if it's not controlled, it can lead to some very extreme results. For a lot of people who have faced personal tragedies, who have said like loss of money or wishes not being answered, they've turned to atheism. Because in their minds they think, you know what, God ignored me, I prayed for him for so long, I suffered, all my relatives died, or I lost all this money, and so that means there's no God, or I don't care about him. And so they turn to atheism. So that's something that we have to be on guard on. People hurt us. That's another common reason. You know, people, you know, disputes, you know, family members, friends, usually the ones who are closest to us, they're the ones who tend to disappoint us the most when we're let down. If somebody is, let's say somebody who we don't know very well, you know, does something we don't like, we can live with it. But if it's somebody who's very close to you, who you have a lot of time, energy, emotions invested in, then you will be much more disappointed and angry. And lastly, jealousy. You know, jealousy is a very common reason for somebody to get angry. The first creature that we know of that manifested his jealousy in a very bad way was Shaitan. I mean, Shaitan was very jealous of what Nabi Adam ﷺ had going for him. And so as a result, all his actions were a manifestation of this jealousy, this pride, this anger. So we all need to be cognizant of this. Now let's talk a little bit more about the detailed manifestations of anger. So I spoke about it in a very general sense, but I'm going to get a little bit more detailed with you after you send a salawat. Number one, and this is actually a very common one that people often are not aware of, being blunt. You know, basically telling it like it is, as some people like to say. Now this is a form of anger. How? Why? When you are engaging somebody in dialogue, and a person chooses not to have the courtesy of speaking in a very respectful manner, and you know, not being cognizant of the person's emotions, then this is a sign of anger, because you know, you're basically just acting from your feelings, you're acting from how you feel, you're not giving any consideration to how this person, what their emotional state is. Now obviously it's very important to be straightforward and to the point, but not where it entails hurting the other person's feelings or just being very raw about it. So this is a very common one. Another one is road rage. How many of us have been guilty of it? How many of us have experienced it? You know, a lot of times, you know, we might be very like content and happy, or, you know, think of ourselves as pious, but when we get behind that wheel, look out. You know, somebody cuts us off, somebody, you know, unfortunately some of us will use a certain gesture with our hand that we shouldn't use. If somebody does, you know, some other thing on the road, even if we don't use a hand gesture, with our mouths, we'll say things that we don't want our little kids hearing us saying. You know, so this road rage, all for something that, you know, we have no control over. Another very big manifestation of anger is cutting off family relations. Now what do I mean? Often families have disputes over inheritance, over, oh, my sister said so-and-so, my brother said so-and-so, my parents didn't buy me the car that I wanted, whatever the dispute is. These things, unfortunately, if they're not checked, lead to more bitter blood, and then as a result, many times people cut off family relations. And this, my brothers and sisters, is a very big sin, cutting off family relations. It's mentioned in the Quran, we have this in our traditions. In fact, so much so, it's said that a person who intentionally cuts off family relations shortens his or her life. And on the flip side, if somebody maintains good family relations, it lengthens their lives. And again, I want to preface this by saying I know that there's exceptions. Sometimes there are people who come from very, very abusive families, physically abusive families. So they need to maintain a certain physical distance for their own well-being. So we're not talking about individuals who have to face these kind of things. We're talking about, issues that can be resolved without the use of, without anything involving violence or anything like that. Now, we've talked about some of the manifestations of anger. Now we need to talk about how do we deal with anger. Okay, we know we're angry, what do we do about it? So the teachings of the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam have taught us a few things. One very basic thing they have taught us, and from this we can learn some other things, is, for example, if you're sitting, you stand up. If you're standing, sit down. There is I would encourage you to read and discover, knowledge from wherever you can. People have done research. There's a person that I personally like to listen to, and I would encourage you to listen to as well. He's very good in the area of behavior modification and improving yourself. Tony Robbins, and he talks about dealing with this. He uses this. He actually employs this principle, because the principle here that is being talked about is changing your state. So when a person's standing up, sitting down, you're changing your state. So he says this as well. He says, change your state. So what's another way to change your state? So for example, let's say, I'm feeling very angry about something. To do something like maybe exercise, or do something where I do something hilarious, something totally off the wall, something that's not the norm. Because when you change your state, you break the cycle of feeling angry and angry and angry. So very important to change your state in this particular circumstances. I wanted to share a story of somebody who, somebody who comes here a lot. He's not here, but somebody I respect. Some of his relatives told me the story, and I thought it was a very beautiful story. This person is a businessman, and this businessman was, engaging in business with a customer of his. Now, this customer of his got very angry about something. So this businessman and the customer, argued back and forth, and finally the customer got so angry that he said, "Go to hell." This was his reaction. Now, if somebody says something like that to us, what's our knee-jerk instant reaction? We say the same thing. But no, what did this man say? He said, after the customer said, "Go to hell," this person said, "You can go to heaven." And so it just changed the man's state altogether. And so the man himself felt very bad. He apologized. And so, it just goes to show, sometimes if you choose to take the better path, you choose to be the better person, it can have lasting positive consequences. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Now, anger is something that we can go on and discuss, and I would encourage you to do, as much research as you can on this topic, work with people. But one work that I would recommend those of you who are interested in reading, there's a work called 40 Hadith by Ayatollah Khomeini. And what he does in this work, he breaks down the different sins. So for example, hasad, envy, anger, ghadab, all these different things. He talks about it from a very spiritual, philosophical aspect. So I would encourage those of you who have an interest in this to please, read that, because he goes at length in discussing this. So another lesson that I'd like to share with you that we can derive from the life of Imam Musa al-Kazim alayhi salam is the issue of black and white thinking. A lot of times we have a tendency to be very extreme in one way or another without maintaining any type of balance. And I've talked about this numerous times, but the reason I wanted to bring this up today is because Imam Musa al-Kazim alayhi salam has a very, very powerful lesson in this, something that happened during his lifetime. So he had two companions who both worked for Harun al-Rashid. And again, calling him a Rashid is an insult because he was far from a Rashid. But I'd prefer to just call him Harun the Abbasid. Harun was one of the biggest oppressors of the Ahlul Bayt and the followers of Ahlul Bayt. So anyway, the names of these companions were Safwan and Ali bin Yaqtin. Both of them worked for Harun, but one of them, the Imam said, stop working for Harun. The other one, the Imam said, continue working with Harun. So let's start with Safwan. Safwan had a camel renting business back then. Kind of the equivalent of that today would be Avis, Hertz, rent a car, things like that. So he had his own version of Avis, Hertz in terms of renting camels. So his customer was Harun, one of his customers. So Imam is having a dialogue with Safwan, and he says to him, Safwan, you're a good man, but your business with Harun is not good. And naturally, Safwan, like most of us, was defensive. He had his own knee-jerk reaction, said, but Imam, I rent these camels out for Harun to do Hajj. Okay, so Imam starts having a dialogue with him. He says, do you get paid for this? Safwan says, yes, I get paid for this. And so then he said, as a result of you getting paid for this, that means you have hope that Harun stays alive so you can get paid, correct? And he says, yes. So then Imam Musa al-Kazim responded by saying, that means if you have hope for this desire to stay alive, it's almost like you're one of them. So then once Safwan realized his mistake, he sold off his business and he stayed away from this totally. Now for the other companion, Ali bin Yaqtin. Ali bin Yaqtin was one of the ministers of Harun. He had a very, very high position. The Imam, instead of telling him to stop working with Harun, he commanded him to keep working with Harun. The ministers of Harun were all very jealous and very petty, and they were very jealous of Ali bin Yaqtin. He was very good at what he did, and Harun had respect for him for the kind of work that he did. So they tried to plot against him. And Imam Musa al-Kazim was aware of all this. He anticipated all this. So in anticipation of this, Imam Musa al-Kazim said, when you do wudu, do it the way they do it, in their school of thought. Don't do wudu the way you normally do it. So Ali bin Yaqtin was like, okay. So one time, as the other co-ministers of Harun, they start egging Harun on, saying, oh, this is Ali bin Yaqtin, he's a Rafidi, he's a follower of Musa al-Kazim. Harun's like, nah, that can't be true. But finally, they convince him to keep a closer eye on Ali bin Yaqtin. So one time, Harun decides to watch how Ali bin Yaqtin is doing wudu. As he's watching him, he notices that Ali bin Yaqtin is doing wudu the way they do. So after observing this, he was like, no, see, he's one of us. So this was a form of taqiyya that Imam Musa al-Kazim had ordered Ali bin Yaqtin to do. So after this, Harun was not worried anymore, and Ali bin Yaqtin went back to doing the work that he was doing. And what's important to note is that in his position, Ali bin Yaqtin was able to help followers of Ahlul Bayt, because it's not permitted for anybody to help an oppressor. But the thing is, in his work, he was helping other people from being oppressed. So this is why the Imam allowed him. So again, it's very important to note that we should never have an all or nothing kind of attitude when it comes to certain things. We have to evaluate each situation on its own merit. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Now, in addition to learning about the lessons of the Ahlul Bayt, we also need to remember their tragedy. And when we think about their tragedy, sorrow fills our heart. And we just stand in amazement that these individuals who are so close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who are loved by the masses, were loathed and envied by those in power, by those who cared only about money and prestige. Brothers and sisters, there are many tragedies when it comes to Imam Musa al-Kazim alayhi salam. I had mentioned that he spent 15 years of his life, more than 15 years of his life in prison, being shuffled from prison to prison to prison. Imam Musa al-Kazim was betrayed by his own relative, Ali ibn Ismail ibn Jafar ibn Muhammad. His story was this. He had become close to one of the people close to the Abbasids, and they wanted to take advantage of this. So they offered to give him money. It's unfortunate how people will sell their soul for money. And so then he agreed. So Imam Musa al-Kazim knew that this man, this relative of his, would betray him. So like always, as has always been the tradition of the followers, the members of Ahlul Bayt and their followers, he had a dialogue with him. That's before he's going. He says to him, he says, Ali, where are you going? Ali says, I'm going to Baghdad. Imam al-Kazim says, why are you going to Baghdad? He says, I'm in debt. I need money. Imam Musa al-Kazim responds, I'll give you that money. Don't go to Baghdad. But Ali was afflicted with the disease of luxury and greed, and he didn't listen. Despite this, Imam gave him money. And so much so that his other relatives said, this Ali is bad to you. Why are you giving him this money? He says that, don't you know that we're supposed to be good, we're supposed to take care of our relatives? This was the attitude of Imam Musa al-Kazim. This is the attitude of a man who would later go and betray Imam Musa al-Kazim. So this Ali goes to Baghdad. He's in the court of Harun. He starts saying all these things to incite Harun to go from Baghdad to Medina and get Imam Musa al-Kazim. So Harun and his forces, they proceed to Medina. And Harun makes this fake dua when he sees the tomb of the Prophet. He says, O Messenger of God, forgive me. I need to arrest your son because of fitna. And we know that this is utter nonsense, that Harun was the one who was Abu Fitna. He was the one who hurt so many innocent people, who shed the blood of many innocent individuals. So then they go and they arrest Imam Musa al-Kazim while he was in Masjid al-Nabawi, while he was praying. They didn't even let him finish his prayers. And Harun was very insecure, as were all the rulers of the Ahlul Bayt. There's a short incident that happened where Harun was trying to pride himself on the fact that he was an Abbasid and he had a connection to the Prophet. And he was a little jealous that the Imam Musa al-Kazim was an actual direct descendant of the Prophet. So Harun is going on bragging and trying to belittle the Imam. So the Imam Musa al-Kazim asks him a question. He says, Harun, if the Prophet was resurrected and he asked for your daughter's hand in marriage, would you do so? And Harun said, yes, of course. It'd be an honor for me for my daughter to be married to the Prophet. He said, would the Prophet do the same with my daughter? And Harun just looked at him in silence. He said, no. My daughter would be the great-great-granddaughter of the Prophet. That would not happen. We are the children of the Prophet. So all these things, all this jealousy built up in the heart of Harun. And he had him imprisoned. You know, brothers and sisters, a tragedy is compounded upon a tragedy. We see that even today, that Muslims, without doing proper research, respect an individual Harun. There are people who call Harun al-Rashid this great leader in Abbasid history and brought all this money and wealth to Muslims, but they fail to see that, or they're ignorant of the fact that he oppressed so many individuals, including the family of the Prophet. And even today, this ignorance continues today. When we see people calling Saddam Hussein a great man. I had an incident a few days ago where I went to get my car fixed, and it was a Muslim. And somehow the issue of Iraq came up, and the name Saddam Hussein was brought up. And he says to me, Rahmatullah alayhi. And I looked at him in disbelief. I said, Rahmatullah alayhi, you mean La'natullah alayhi? And it was just very shocking how people, instead of following individuals, they need to follow principles. But instead, we fall into this trap. And unfortunately, all of us are guilty of this. We don't look at issues critically, we just look at parties. We look at a particular hizb, we don't evaluate the issue on its own merit. So it's not, everybody is guilty of this in one shape or another. So that's another tragedy, brother. So Imam Musa al-Kazim was moved from prison to prison. The reason he was moved from prison to prison, and this, subhanAllah, this is something about the akhlaq and nature of Imam Musa al-Kazim, is each time he was in a prison, Harun would want the jailer to kill him, to punish him. And the jailer said, no, we can't. This Imam, this Musa al-Kazim is such a pious individual. In his dua, he never curses you, he never curses us. How can we punish such a person? So then he was moved to another prison, and then to another prison. And finally, he was moved to a prison where he was poisoned. And before he was poisoned, Harun, to save his neck, to make himself feel a little bit better, according to some narrations, say that he sent an emissary, a note to Imam Musa al-Kazim saying, I know that you're not guilty of any sins, but say in publicly that you committed a sin and that you're guilty of it, and I'll forgive you and we can get you out of prison and so forth. Of course, Imam Musa al-Kazim refuses. So then we know that he got poisoned later. And after this, it gets even worse than that. Imam Musa al-Kazim's relatives were not even properly informed. As Brother Walid mentioned, his body was taken to a bridge and left on a bridge for 3 days in Baghdad. 3 days. There's a narration that states a doctor came to examine this particular body. They say that some of the friends of Imam Musa al-Kazim were there and the relatives had not gotten there yet. And so the doctor says that to the other individuals who were with the body of Imam Musa al-Kazim, they say that you should inform the relatives that diya, compensation, is due to this man. And they said, why? The doctor said there's poison all over his body. Inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Brothers and sisters, please join me in dua. Please raise your hands for dua. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Oh Allah, please forgive us for all of our sins. Ya Ghafar, Ya Tawwab, Ya Allah. Ya Allah, please, those of us who are facing poverty and difficult financial situations, please grant us from your rizq. Ya Razaq, Ya Ghani, Ya Allah. Ya Allah, when the son of Imam Musa al-Kazim comes, Al-Qaim, Al-Mahdi, let us be of those who are with him and not against him. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali.